Are we set? Okay, good. Good afternoon, and welcome to St. Cyprian's Episcopal Church. On behalf of our rector, Reverend Richard Gonzalez and Reverend Steve Seibert, I want to welcome you especially to this very, very warm and historic spot. We love sitting here, and we all love each other, and it's a wonderful place to be. And so if you are visiting for the first time, please know that you are welcome, and we hope you will visit us often. This afternoon, we have the great privilege of hearing David Nolan speak, but I thought that maybe before he speaks, it might be a wonderful thing for us to sing a few Negro spirituals. Negro spirituals were written beginning in the 1700s, and as I'm sure you know, that the slaves were not able to worship openly, so they met surreptitiously in the fields, in the woods, and they often sang songs and created songs which were about how to get free. What's the best way to avoid the dogs? Well, you might want to wade in the water. And so we're going to sing that today. And there are other songs of liberation and freedom which were created at that time, which we still sing. We still call them Negro spirituals, and we should, because it's a term of great, great respect. These are songs of hardship, but they're songs also of faith and which express a lot of hope. So the songs provided comfort and resilience during the darkest periods of slavery and segregation. Singing together is always a good thing. We always feel better when we sing together, I think. Of course I would, wouldn't I? But anyway, we feel better when we sing together. And it allowed the enslaved communities to feel that there was hope and there was comfort amongst them. They incorporated biblical themes of deliverance and liberation, and they turned often to stories of the Exodus, and they found inspiration and spiritual framework to endure their hardships. Some examples of these wonderful spirituals that were written that time about liberation are Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which is a powerful song about deliverance and about a journey to freedom. Go Down, Moses, which reference, of course, the biblical story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt. Wade in the Water, used to tell people and to lead them to rivers to help them escape from slavery. Follow the Drinking Gourd, which was a coded guide to the North Star for the escaping slaves. And also, he's got the whole world in his hands, which is a joyful expression of how we will be saved. And finally, nobody knows the troubles I've seen, which is a song of suffering and perseverance. So the first song we're going to sing is Every Time I Feel the Spirit, which is, I think, a song of hope. But then we're going to sing a couple of songs which have to do with deliverance and deliverance from bondage and slavery. I was privileged when I was teaching school in Atlanta to teach in a school that was 94% African American students. And I remember one time when we were singing Lift Every Voice and Sing, that one of the teachers came to me and said, "You know, you're playing it too fast. This is the saddest song in the world, and it has to be sung very slowly." So this morning we sang it in church, and I tried to play it slowly. But it's really hard once you get... You know, to keep it slow. But today I'm going to do my best to play these, and I know I'm an old hot woman, but I hope that you will sing, even though I'm trying my best to play them correctly.
Good afternoon. I'm Hugh McClellan, one of the wardens at St. Cyprian's, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Nolan. For me, things are always so much more interesting if I know a little more background behind them. So I'm going to share some background behind David Nolan, the person. Since arriving in 1977, historian David Nolan has played a pivotal role in uncovering and preserving the city's rich and once overlooked civil rights history. Hired to survey the city's historic buildings, Nolan was initially advised to avoid Lincolnville, as there was no history there, and to steer clear of mentioning Martin Luther King Jr. in his studies. Nolan, who had moved to St. Augustine after following the civil rights movement through the South, said, "Then you've hired the wrong person for this job." Following his convictions over his directive, David spent years uncovering a wealth of staggering stories in that neighborhood with no history that had been previously swept under the rug. There was a deep obligation to preserve this history properly, and he recognized that bringing it to light would shift the town's relationship with its history. St. Augustine holds a unique place in American history as the only city in Florida where Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and an elemental player in the fight for civil rights. However, due to the lack of mainstream news coverage at the time, it is rarely mentioned in the same breath as Birmingham or Selma. Nolan's work has been instrumental in bringing these stories to light. He recounts how the city, on the brink of celebrating its 400th anniversary in 1964, planned an all-white event, which sparked protests and drew national attention to the racial injustices in this area. These events played a significant role in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These are the facts of the time, but Nolan's passion for history goes beyond documentation. He has continuously participated in the fight for human rights by ensuring that the struggle is properly documented. He was a driving force behind the creation of the Freedom Trail, a series of markers commemorating significant sites in St. Augustine's civil rights history. Despite initial resistance from local governments and organizations, Nolan and a group of younger activists successfully secured funding from Northrop Grumman, the city's largest employer. Their persistence led to the installation of 30 markers, ensuring that the stories of courage and struggle would not be forgotten. When asked today, even though Nolan has produced a very large body of work, he says that these markers are his proudest achievement. They had successfully brought this story to light for the tourists and locals alike. Through his work, David has demonstrated how history is not just a record of the past, but a powerful tool for shaping the present and the future. He emphasizes the importance of reclaiming history, particularly in a place like St. Augustine, where the narrative has often been distorted or ignored. His dedication to uncovering the truth and advocating for justice has left an indelible mark on the community. As David approaches his 80th birthday, he reflects on the progress made and the challenges that remain. He acknowledges that history is not linear and progress is not guaranteed. His work serves as a reminder that preserving history requires a consistent vigilance, and that the stories of the past are essential to understanding and shaping the future. Please join me in welcoming David Nolan.
When I was making some notes for today's talk, it seemed to me that the story of Martin Luther King and St. Augustine divides into before, during, and after, because it's a continuous story that goes back. Now, last week we marked the 97th birthday of Martin Luther King. And, that makes him a young whippersnapper to Dr. Dorothy Israel, an elder to the rest of us, even those of us who are about to turn 80. But there were significant people that Martin Luther King knew before he ever set foot in St. Augustine. And the first of them lived right down the street at what's now appropriately 156 Martin Luther King Avenue. And her name was Janie Price, and she was a longtime public health nurse here, and so beloved she's been called the Florence Nightingale of St. Johns County. And stories are told of how she would get up in the middle of the night on a weekend and go out to treat somebody because there was nobody else to do it. And the people she treated included the family of Halstead Hosmanussi, who was the leader of the opposition to the civil rights movement here. So she was a wonderful person to know. But long before anybody knew these stories of her, she had grown up in St. Augustine, and she took her nurses training during World War II, a special program to train black nurses at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. And to have a little R&R from time to time, they would organize dances for the black nurses from Grady Hospital with the black college students from Morehouse College. And she met then, and her roommate was dating then, a young teenage Morehouse College student named Martin, and they got along just fine. And in later years, she liked to joke, well, of course I knew Martin, but I didn't know he was Martin Luther King. But she saw when he came here 20 years later and spoke up the street at St. Paul AME Church that he was indeed the same young teenager she remembered from her days in Atlanta. And he recognized her, and he and his close comrade in arms and fellow goer to jail in many different cities, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, spent the night at Janie Price's house down the street here before they went off to be arrested at the Monson Motel on the Bayfront, the only place in Florida where Dr. King was arrested. So that was, I think, the first person in St. Augustine who ever knew Martin Luther King, even if she thought of him only by his first name in those early years. Now, we had a black college here for half a century out on West King Street. It had originally started in Jacksonville as Florida Baptist Academy in the 1890s, and then it moved here in 1918, and it was known over its half century here sometimes as Florida Normal because its bread and butter was training black school teachers, and later as Florida Memorial College, and it's now in Miami, and it's Florida Memorial University. And the second president of that school, Dr. William H. Gray, was a Baptist minister. It was a Baptist school. And he came from a notable family of Baptist divines in Philadelphia. And for nearly a century, three people, all named William Gray, Senior, Junior, and the Third, were at the helm of Bright Hope Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And when Dr. Gray came here, his closest friends in St. Augustine were Rosalie Gordon, a longtime member of this church, and her husband, Dr. Rudolph Gordon, and they are honored on a stained glass window right over here, which you should see if you have never looked at it carefully. So they were very close to the Grays while they were here. And Dr. Gray went from here to Tallahassee, where he was president of what's now Florida A&M University for several years after his stint in St. Augustine. And then he went back up to Philadelphia to take over the Bright Hope Baptist Church from his father. And when Bright Hope got a new sanctuary built in the 1950s, who turned the first shovel of dirt for it? The hero of the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. Martin Luther King. And he already knew the Gray family because, you know, there is this church network that goes on in our country. And Martin Luther King, after he graduated from Morehouse College, still a very young man, went off to Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and the closest big Baptist church was that of Dr. William H. Gray, and he would send reports to Martin Luther King's parents in Atlanta about, "I've met your son, and he's a fine young man," and this. So that connection with the Gray family, which had left their mark here in St. Augustine, was also a connection between Dr. King and the ancient city long before he ever came here. Now in 1960, February 1st, 1960, so we're about to have an anniversary, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina A&T College, sat in the Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Greensboro. You know, Woolworth's was the Walmart of its day, and if you were black, you could go there and buy anything you wanted, but you couldn't sit down and eat a hamburger or drink a Coca-Cola, because that was for whites only. And these college students decided it was time for that to end. And their action was a spark that started a prairie fire that just zoomed across the South in all these cities and towns that had black colleges, one of which was St. Augustine. So within 6 weeks of that initial lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro, the students at Florida Memorial College marched into town and sat in at our local Woolworth store. They went there one day and were not served. They went there the second day, and a crowd of white thugs gathered outside, painted racial slurs on the building. And the third day they went, Reverend Thomas Wright, who was president of the local NAACP, called up the local black taxi cab company and said, "I want you to go down to the Woolworths, and I want you to pull up on the sidewalk and park so close that only your door and the door of Woolworths will open and provide a protective barrier, and get those students out of there before they get killed by the crowd that has gathered." Now, all of these students from Florida, from North Carolina, from Virginia, had a meeting later that year at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and formed a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a legendary civil rights group of the 1960s. And one of the people who was a founder of SNCC had grown up on the street just behind us here, Twine Street. His name was Hank Thomas, and he's still alive. He is the last surviving member of the original group of freedom riders that went through the South in 1961 on Greyhound and Trailways buses and challenged racial discrimination at the bus stations of the South. And he wound up in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, charged with attempting to overthrow the government of Mississippi by entering a white restroom. They had very creative lawyers who could probably get jobs in the Department of Justice today. But Hank Thomas attended the conference, and Martin Luther King attended that conference where SNCC was organized. And there's a wonderful photograph that has been reproduced in many history books showing Dr. King and Hank Thomas. Now, Hank Thomas is kind of a man mountain, and you know, Dr. King was fairly small, so Hank Thomas always looms large in that photograph. And that's not the only photograph he looms large in either, because the bus he was on as a freedom rider has become legendary in American history. It's called the Burning Bus. Because just outside of Anniston, Alabama, some whites waylaid the bus, and what they did was they threw a firebomb underneath it, and then they went up and pushed on the door of the bus so nobody could get out of it. And I heard Hank Thomas tell this story when he was the main speaker at the dedication for the Foot Soldiers Monument in the plaza in St. Augustine. He said, you know, we were just coughing and we were wondering, you know, we knew we were going to die, but would we die from smoke inhalation, or would we die because that firebomb would set the gas tank of the bus on fire? He said, you know, I was the biggest person on that bus. He'd been a football player. So I went up and I pushed on that door, and I pushed on that door, and finally I got it open. And the people were getting up and they were crawling out and they were getting out into the fresh air and coughing and trying to get air into their lungs. And he said, and then this white man came up to me and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said to myself, a human white person. And that's when he hit me with a 2x4. I will never forget that telling of the story. But anyhow, Hank Thomas was somebody from St. Augustine that Martin Luther King knew before he ever set foot in the ancient city. Dr. Gray's successor as president of Florida Memorial out west of town here was a man named Reverend John Tilley. And Reverend Tilley went on, after serving as president of the college there, to become the first executive director of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So here was another St. Augustine connection before Dr. King ever came here. And then there's the question of what did Dr. King know about St. Augustine? And certainly he knew about the sit-in that took place here in 1960, because that was the time of all those students who led to the creation of SNCC and that conference that Dr. King attended in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he also knew that we were going to have this all-white celebration as the nation's oldest city in 1964. Now, if you were here at the time, you will remember when St. George Street, the heart of our tourist trap district, was the old downtown Main Street. You know, it had Sears Roebuck and Western Auto and Service Paint and Glass and drugstores and stuff. But it was decided, particularly during the economic recession of 1958, that there was money to be had in St. Augustine's past. If only we could recreate it, since so much of it had been destroyed over the years. And we looked longingly at Williamsburg, Virginia, which had been a project of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And we said, well, we can be the Spanish colonial Williamsburg. And I've always thought, well, we're older than Williamsburg. Why aren't they the British colonial St. Augustine? But that was not the way. You know, money talked in those days. And they got the state legislature to fund what I think of as the St. George Street project that turned it from looking like the old Main Street to looking like the tourist trap it is today. And there was something in the wording of that initial legislation that should have really been a red flag to the world, but evidently wasn't at the time. That law began saying, St. Augustine is the oldest community of the white race in the United States. Well, welcome to the 1960s. Dr. King knew of that. And he knew when the St. George Street project got underway, mostly it involved restoring some old buildings that were there, and I go along with that. But it also involved tearing down what they called Victorian garbage and building fake Spanish colonial buildings on the site, and that quickly overwhelmed actual restoration. So, I always say I can take you down St. George Street and I can show you the original buildings and the buildings that they reconstructed, because the reconstructions all have 90-degree angles and sharp corners, and the originals all have a little bit of wobble to them from their hundreds of years of existence. And anyhow, when they had completed the first restoration, the Vice President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, was invited down to dedicate it. And they were going to have a banquet for him in the best facility in town, which was our Ponce de Leon Hotel, built by Henry Flagler in the 1880s and not yet given over to Flagler College. And so, in line with what was considered standard operating procedure at the day, it was going to be for whites only. And we had acquired a new dentist in town who succeeded to Dr. Gordon. He rented Dr. Gordon's office, and this didn't sit well with him. So he and others wrote to Vice President Lyndon Johnson and said, don't come down here to take part in a segregated banquet. And while you're at it, don't have the federal government send hundreds of thousands of dollars to St. Augustine to celebrate its 400th birthday. And Dr. Haling used to joke in his later days, he said, that's when I became radioactive in St. Augustine. Turn down money? Are you crazy? So there were many negotiations back and forth. And finally, it was agreed that 2 tables would be set aside in an alcove where black St. Augustinians could attend. And those tables would be integrated because that would be where the Secret Service and FBI also sat. And so, that happened. And President Johnson's people promised that, the next day, the city commission would meet with them to hear their grievances and do something about them. And I've been told many times the story of how black people went down to City Hall and went in, and there was not a living city commissioner present. There was a tape recorder and a sign saying, please record your name and address. So Dr. Haling, ever after, he said, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. He would never again accept any deal that did not involve something being done directly. But Dr. King was aware of this, and he was among many people who sent protests against St. Augustine's 400th birthday being celebrated on an all-white basis. President John Kennedy had appointed a national commission to celebrate the 400th birthday, and it had Henry Ford II, and it had the Archbishop of St. Augustine and the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, many prominent people from around the country on it. And none of them seemed to see any problem with this being done on an all-white basis. So this became very much a contributing factor to the demonstrations that were to take place that year and the next in St. Augustine. And the other thing that happened in the summer and around Labor Day, Dr. Haling organized the NAACP youth group into taking part in lunch counter sit-ins and demonstrations, one of which took place at the old slave market in the plaza. And people were arrested. St. Augustine's powers that were not terribly creative. They thought, okay, we'll crush them. And that seemed to be the entire gist of their response to this. And so there were 4 young people who wound up after a sit-in at the Woolworths lunch counter downtown on the plaza, spending the next 6 months in jail and reform school because their parents would not sign a document promising that they would not take part in any civil rights activities until they were 21 years old. And they were about 15 or 16 then, this was. So these came to be known as the St. Augustine Four, and their incarceration produced editorials in the Miami Herald and the New York Times. Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a newspaper column and protested it, and Jackie Robinson, who also wrote a newspaper column, protested it. But yet they stayed. When their lawyers went to the court, they said, or to the local court, they said, well, we can't do it. They're out of the legal system. They're in the juvenile justice system, so they're there until they're 21. And this farce went on until January of 1964, when the New York World's Fair was about to open. And Florida had a pavilion at the New York World's Fair, and there were threats to picket the Florida Pavilion, the Sunshine State, where children are kept in reform school. And so the governor and cabinet held a special meeting in Tallahassee and released the St. Augustine Four. And a few months later, when Jackie Robinson came to St. Augustine and spoke up the street at St. Paul AME Church, he traveled with a court reporter from New York named Herb Landman, who called me a few years ago and told me the story. He said, I want you to go out and find those young people. And he invited the 2 young women, Audrey Nell Edwards and Joanne Anderson Ulmer, to go to Connecticut to stay at the Jackie Robinson family home to recuperate from their ordeal. So Dr. King was familiar with all these things about St. Augustine before he ever came here. Now, given the relative balance of power in St. Augustine at the time, St. Augustine was 20 to 25% black. There were no black elected officials, no black judges, no black lawyers, you name it. All of the levers of power were controlled by whites. And Dr. Haling was a very savvy person. He said, we knew we needed outside help. So they heard that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was going to be having a meeting in Orlando, Florida. And they took a delegation from here, Dr. Haling, Henry Twine, several others, and they went down to the SCLC meeting there, hoping to have a chance to talk with Martin Luther King and convince him to come to St. Augustine. And they were not able to do that. The people they dealt with in SCLC were very savvy people. And they wanted to know that they wouldn't be sending Dr. King into some quagmire, some losing situation, So they held back a little. But our delegation down there had a sales pitch already. They said, look, you are trying to get this Civil Rights Act passed through Congress. And it deals with segregated hotels and motels and restaurants. And St. Augustine has nothing but segregated hotels and motels and restaurants. So you can make your point very clearly. And they said it's a small town. It's not 1 million or 2 million people, so it's manageable in size. And it's a famous place. It's America's oldest city. It's about to celebrate its 400th birthday. There'll be a lot of publicity, so that'll be good. And they said it's a tourist town. And most of the tourists are northerners, and they'll be more or less sympathetic. So this is the perfect place if you want a stage for a moral drama to show the world why we need this law, which will change those old ways of doing things. St. Augustine is the place. And then I'm sure they smiled their best smile, and they saw some skeptical looks. But eventually, here's what happened. The SCLC people said, look, we can't commit Dr. King, but we will see if there are possibilities in St. Augustine. So we have a very active group of supporters in Massachusetts, and we will ask them to work with you to do something during the Easter holidays. And we'll see how that goes, and we'll see where we go from there. Well, the Boston people recruited 4 socially prominent Boston women. 3 of them were the wives of Episcopal bishops. 2 were white, 1 was black. And the 4th woman was the wife of the vice president of John Hancock Insurance Company. So all of a sudden, I've read all the old FBI files from St. Augustine, and they were always signed by the lowliest clerk in the FBI, until word got out that Mrs. Peabody, who was not only the wife of an Episcopal bishop and the cousin of Eleanor Roosevelt, but also the mother of the sitting governor of Massachusetts. So when word came out that the governor's mother was going to go to St. Augustine and might be arrested, all the FBI reports are signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself. And it was a tremendous success. The front page of the New York Times on April Fool's Day, 1964, reported the arrest of the 72-year-old mother of the governor of Massachusetts at the Ponce de Leon Motor Lodge, just north of town. And the people from SCLC said, yes, well, maybe St. Augustine is the place. So in May of 1964, as the Senate was continuing the longest filibuster in its history against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Martin Luther King came to St. Augustine for the first time and spoke. Now, there was a problem. So many people wanted to hear Dr. King speak that there was no church large enough to hold them all. So just up the street here you have St. Paul AME Church, and then right around the corner from it you have the First Baptist Church. So what they did was they held rallies simultaneously in both of those churches and shuttled Dr. King out the back door of one church and in the back door of the other, so everybody would have a chance to hear him. That meeting was chaired by my old friend Henry Twine, who went on to become the longest serving black elected official in St. Augustine's 20th century history, and the street right behind us bears his name. So this was the beginning. Now they had rented a beach house for Dr. King. There was a sympathetic retired dentist and his wife from New Jersey, Dr. and Mrs. Canwright. And they had a modest little beach house down, not in the Black Beach, Butler Beach, but just a block away from it. And they arranged to rent it to Dr. King. And in one of the lower moments of local journalistic history, the St. Augustine Record ran on the front page directions of how to find the beach house rented from Martin Luther King. And it was shot up and firebombed, not once but 3 times, to international publicity. And one of the iconic photographs of the civil rights movement was taken there with Dr. King pointing to a bullet hole in the window. And that beach house is still standing. It's no longer at the beach. It's out in West Augustine on what was the former campus of Florida Memorial College. There's a long story behind that, but at least it does still survive. And when you go inside, you can see burn marks on the floor from the firebombing in 1964. So this was kind of Martin Luther King's welcome to St. Augustine. And because of the danger, both Dr. Haling and Mr. Twine told me many times stories of taking Martin Luther King ostentatiously in the front door of a house and surreptitiously out the back door and through the yard and onto the next street to another house, so anybody who was watching would not know where Martin Luther King was staying. Before he passed away in 1994, I got Mr. Twine to take me around. I said, I want you to show me every place you can remember where Martin Luther King stayed. Because, you know, you travel in some parts of the country and you see these signs that say, George Washington slept here. You know, you think he had sleeping sickness. But as a historian, I know that someday we will have to have signs everywhere saying Martin Luther King stayed here. But because it was kept secret at the time, for obvious reasons, it risked being lost forever. So I'm always grateful to Mr. Twine. The first house he pointed out to me was Janie Price's house down the street at what's now 156 Martin Luther King Avenue. So this was a little act for not letting history disappear in our time. Now, I've always thought that the leaders of the civil rights movement should have been given every Oscar, Emmy, and Tony Award there is, because they had a perfect sense of how to dramatize a situation and show it so nobody could miss what was wrong. And Mr. Twine was my great teacher in the inside story of the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. He said, look, we were no dummies. He said, back in those days, the Monson Motel was the brand new motel on the bayfront in St. Augustine. And that's where the media people stayed. And we knew if you wanted to get publicity, you don't make them come to you, you go to them. So the Monson became the stage for many of the most dramatic episodes in the movement. And he said, we also knew that if you do something one day, it'll be on the front page of the paper. If you do it the next day, it'll be on the back page of the paper. And if you do it the third day, it's not news at all and won't be reported. So he said, we had a strategy meeting every night at Dr. Haling's dental office, the former dental office of Dr. Gordon, and we would decide what could we do that would be new and slightly different the next day so it would qualify as news. And so he said, one day, somebody said, you know, the Monson Motel, it has this little postage stamp sized swimming pool. Why don't we have a swim in there? And he said, we talked about it and decided it was a pretty good idea. And then as the meeting was breaking up, we looked around that room and realized that not a single person in that room knew how to swim. And with all the tension and violence in St. Augustine, we were not about to get into that pool. He said, but Hosea Williams, who has been described as King's kamikaze, said he was going to say that. He said, no, I know some black people in Georgia who know how to swim, and I'll send for them. And so here is how they put together the scenario for this event. In those days, there was a legal fiction that if you were a registered guest at a motel, you could invite visitors to come in and use the facilities. So they got two ringers, two whites who were not known here, to come down, one from Atlanta and one from Washington, and register as guests at the Monson Motel. Perfectly fine. And so then you have to picture the scenario as Henry laid it out for me. He said you had these two whites in their room there, and the door is cracked, and they're peering out. And they're looking for Dr. Haling's little yellow Volkswagen to drive up next to the pool and disgorge several black people from Georgia in swimsuits. And they're all going to go and run in, jump in, and the whites are going to say, it's okay, they're our guests, they're our guests. He said, that sounded pretty good to us, but you know, really, St. Augustine was so violent that after a day or two we said, you know, those people may be dead before they ever hit the water. So they needed some decoys. Okay, now one of the events of this great moral drama was the arrest of Martin Luther King while attempting to be admitted to the restaurant at the Monson Motel. And you've all heard of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right? Well, there's also a letter from the St. Augustine jail. And he wrote it to an old friend of his, Rabbi Israel Dresner, up in New Jersey. And he said, I know you're about to go to a meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in Atlantic City. And I want you to urge the rabbis to come down and take part in our movement in St. Augustine. So 16 of America's most distinguished Reformed Jewish rabbis answered his call, and they came down. And what are they going to do when they get here? Well, they were going to be the decoys. The manager of the Monson Motel, Mr. Brock, was a Baptist deacon, and he was having culture shock when all these rabbis came up and said they were going to have a pray-in in front of his motel. He said, you are not? And he said, let us pray. You're not going to pray here. This is private property. And I was just watching the film footage of it last night. It's very bracing and also somewhat hilarious in a kind of ghoulish sort of way. So he thought this was the worst thing he'd ever seen. And he was hitting these rabbis and demanding that they be arrested and everything. And then all of a sudden somebody said, oh my God, look at the swimming pool. And there were black and white together swimming in the Monson pool. And Mr. Brock, who was the president of the Florida Hotel and Motel Association at the time, went and got 2 jugs of muriatic acid and went around the swimming pool. The most famous photograph ever taken in St. Augustine shows Jimmy Brock pouring acid in the Monson pool while people are swimming in it. And that photograph appeared on the front page of the Washington, D.C. newspaper the day the U.S. Senate went to vote on passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So if there was any wavering vote, all they had to do was look at that horrible picture and say, we need that law. So one of the people who was in the Monson pool when the acid was poured told me, he said, you know, maybe we should have given Jimmy Brock a Best Supporting Actor award. Who would have come up with an absurd idea like that? But so those things went. We call that now the splash heard round the world, and it is reported every day. Jimmy's daughter said it's like having the worst day of your life, repeated year after year after year, because it is always there. It appears in history books and the like. But it was the key event there. The Birmingham kind of launched the proposal for a Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the assassination of President Kennedy kept that act alive as the new president vowed to get it passed in tribute to the late president. But it was St. Augustine that got it passed. It's the greatest event of American history that was ever made on the streets of St. Augustine. And we wasted so many years denying it, ignoring it, sweeping it under the rug. But this was really St. Augustine's great contribution, not only to modern democracy, but it changed America and it inspired the world. And I always remember when the Iron Curtain fell in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, I'd turn on the news at night and I couldn't understand the words because they were in Czech or German or Polish or something, but I knew the tune. It was "We Shall Overcome," the anthem of the civil rights movement here. So Dr. King went on from here to win the Nobel Peace Prize. This was the last major campaign before he was awarded that Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I think, that it changed the rest of America more than it changed St. Augustine. It was a traumatic experience for St. Augustine. Instead of the 400th birthday being the greatest and most profitable thing in our history, you saw tourism cut in half because of the widespread publicity about racial episodes here. Time heals all wounds, they say, or time wounds all heals, which is an alternate version of that. But so eventually, in 2002, Mrs. Catherine Twine, Henry Twine's widow, who had come to be known as the Rosa Parks of Florida because she went to jail early and often in the cause of civil rights. She passed away in December of 2002. And after her funeral, a group of people got together and said, we have the 40th anniversary of the demonstrations coming up, and yet we still have this kind of official attitude here that this was a terrible thing. Martin Luther King was a monster who came here to destroy St. Augustine. That was a quote from our former sheriff, L.O. Davis. And we said, we've got to do something to reverse this kind of official verdict on the civil rights movement. And we were optimists, so we started an organization called 40th Accord, as if within 1 year we could resolve all these things. And now Accord is 24 years old and still going. But thank God we were here. So Accord did start the Freedom Trail of marking the civil rights sites. And we did, on the 50th anniversary of the civil rights movement, open the first civil rights museum in the state of Florida. In that self-same building, Dr. Gordon's dental office, built in the 1950s, and the place where they held the strategy meetings that led to the Monson Pool episode and all else. And it's now, continuing to go. The typical Accord meeting winds up with us putting our hands in our pocket and seeing, do we have enough spare change to pay the electric bill next month? But we have managed to stay open, and certainly Dr. Gordon's family have been wonderful about making that building available as a museum all these years. I never had any doubt that in the long run we would give full tourist treatment to Martin Luther King. Come on St. George Street, buy Martin Luther King keychains, t-shirts, hats, whatever. We'll do everything in as bad taste as we do other things here in St. Augustine. I have no doubt. But the question is always, how much are we going to lose between now and then? So we lost the Monson Motel on the bayfront. There was a 5-year battle to try and save it, and the city rewrote every interpretation of every law to make it possible to have the first underground parking garage in St. Augustine and to cram 19 fake colonial buildings on top of that parking garage and all. And you know, in St. Augustine, when you want to tear down a place, you have to go to a meeting and present your case. So I went to more meetings about the Monson over those 5 years than anything else in my life. And every time there was a meeting, the architect on behalf of the Monson would say the same thing. He'd say, "No historic significance. No historic significance." So that ironically gave rise to the Freedom Trail, because we said, well, maybe if we put historic markers in front of these buildings, at least he'll have to think of something new to say, exercise his brain a little. But it just continued. As soon as they got the Monson demolished in 2003, the city came up with a plan to demolish the Ponce de Leon Motor Lodge, which had been on the front page of the New York Times when Mrs. Peabody was arrested there. They said it was blighted. Now, I taught elder hostel classes there for many years, and people from all over the country in those classes would always come, "This is such a nice place." So, you know, you could just see wheels turning in City Hall. If we can make these landmarks disappear, it'll be like it never happened. The other thing lost at the same time, just behind us here, was the home of Hank Thomas, the civil rights pioneer and the last surviving freedom rider from the 1960s. So, you know, we have tried not to lose things as we can, and we've also tried to save things. And you want to save, you know, photographs, for instance. All the news media, all the television stations were down here shooting footage, and we tried to get one picture from the Associated Press to use on one Freedom Trail marker. You know what the price they asked for? $1,500 for one picture. And, you know, Jeremy Dean, who made the first movie about the civil rights movement here, he went in to try and get moving footage, and I think it was like $1,000 a second or something. I mean, it just prohibitively exorbitant. But we need to save this stuff. We have to have some program, you know, whether it's getting a huge grant to pay those things or convincing those news organizations before they go out of existence to share their archives with us, because this is treasure of St. Augustine history that's out there, and it will be lost. I asked Dr. Haling, the leader of the movement here, after we had become friends, I said, "What did you do with all the material from the civil rights movement?" He said, "Well, you know, I had it in a storage unit, and then Hurricane Andrew came along and blew it all away." And the lawyer who handled many of the cases here was Earl Johnson from Jacksonville, all the school desegregation cases and the arrested demonstrators and all of these things. And I was on a panel once with his widow, and I said, "What did you do with your husband's papers?" And she looked at me sadly and said, "You're going to hate me because you're a historian, but I really needed that garage space." So this is how things get lost. Now there used to be, and let me wind up with this, but there used to be a building just up the street here, just north of what's now the Lincolnville Museum, the old Excelsior High School, and it was called Echo House, but it had been a kind of Buckingham Smith nursing home in the 20th century. And it was going to be torn down. And Shirley Williams Collins, who was a wonderful photographer, you used to see her pictures when they had a St. Augustine record spotted column. She was ubiquitous. And she went in there just before it was going to be torn down, and she called up and said, "You know, there are all these papers scattered over the floor of the building. You should come and take a look." And my favorite picture of historic preservation in St. Augustine shows Shirley William Collins and Gwendolyn Duncan from Accord with the trunk of their car open, showing many, many garbage bags filled with the papers that were on that floor. Those papers were the day-to-day records of the civil rights movement here. Everything from medical bills for people who had been beaten in demonstrations to the old, remember the gasoline credit card receipts, and petty cash vouchers from the SCLC office. This was stuff we thought had been lost half a century earlier, and here this great find. So, we have been trying to preserve what we can, and we'll see how we come out at the end of it. Although now that I've entered my 80th year, I think, well, what is the next historian going to do here? Will they be interested, or will they be into something on their telephones? I don't know, but we are grateful to you for being a good audience to hear that. And anytime you can speak up on the importance of saving and preserving our civil rights history, bless you and all of the souls who have been in this beautiful building before will be singing your praises as well. Thank you.
Last year, at Dr. King's memorial commemorative breakfast honoring Dr. King and his legacy, David, some of David's words, one paragraph was, "The future will thank those who started and kept this story alive." And what I'm doing now is saying, St. Cyprian's thanks you, David, for keeping the story alive. Thank you very much.
There are many songs we could sing as we leave tonight, but I feel that "There is a Balm in Gilead" is appropriate because of what's happening in our country and in our world today, and as we remember what has happened here in St. Augustine in the past. So I hope you will stand and we will all sing "There is a Balm in Gilead."
Gilead, you hear the
Mission House, that's right. St. Cyprian's never, ever has a service without afterwards going to the Mission House for treats. Please join us for coffee, drinks, and food.
And thank you, Kathy, for beautiful music.